Now keep in mind, Muhammad did not write the Quran. It was gathered after he died, and it was put together by the third Caliph Uthman in 650 AD.
Can you elaborate? I brought several of our teams from our church, and I wanted them to see, can you go over the differences between Christianity versus the other world religions such as Islam, Catholicism, Mormonism?
You mean in 2 minutes?
Yes.
That's like those are semester courses.
We'll try to.
He's like some kind of radio guy behind the glass going, shorten it up, shorten it up. All right, why don't we just deal with Islam first, okay? Look, there are three great monotheistic religions: Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, okay? In my view, Christianity just completes Judaism. I think the Old Testament is true,
Right.
and I think the New Testament is true as well, so it completes Judaism. Islam comes along, well, first of all, Muhammad is born in 570 AD. In about 610 AD, he seems to think he gets a revelation from God to say that there's only one God. And he goes to Mecca in 622, and he tries to say, in a town that had a lot of idols, because people would go to Mecca and worship these deities, he tried to go in there and say, look, there's just one God. Allah is his name. And so they threw him out. He goes up to Medina, he begins to raid Meccan caravans, and in 630 he takes Mecca by force, but he doesn't have much resistance. He dies 2 years later, probably poisoned by somebody in 632. By 638, his followers have already taken over the Holy Land, and by 732, they've streamed across northern Africa, across the Straits of Gibraltar, into Spain, and were stopped in Tours, France by Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, that's what his name means, Martel. And he pushed them back, and eventually the Muslims retreated back over the Straits of Gibraltar, and to this day, northern Africa is largely, predominantly Muslim. Now, Muhammad, when he was on the earth, never claimed to do miracles. In fact, in the Quran, he says, I'm just a plain warner, I don't do miracles.
Right.
Miracles are attributed to Muhammad about 150 years later in what's called the Hadith, the written traditions of what Muhammad said and did. These people were not eyewitnesses. As I say, it's about 150 years later. And some of the miracles appear to be modifications of Christian miracles, like Jesus turns water into wine, Muhammad turns water into milk. Jesus feeds 5,000, Muhammad feeds, 10 or 50,000, something like that, right? They appear to be kind of borrowed from Christianity, and even many Muslim scholars say they're legendary. So, I don't think there's any supernatural confirmation that Muhammad was a prophet, okay? And the miracles attributed to him were attributed much later. Now, there seems to me an eternal contradiction here for Muslims, because in Surah 568, which is a chapter in the Quran, the 68th verse, it says, O ye people of the book. Who are the people of the book? The Christians and the Jews.
Right.
You have no ground to stand on unless you stand on the law and the Gospels. In other words, the Quran is telling Christians and Jews they ought to obey the Old Testament and the New Testament. The problem is, if you obey the Old Testament and the New Testament, it contradicts with the Quran. Because in Surah 4, verse 157, it says that Jesus never died. He was taken straight to heaven, so he couldn't have resurrected from the dead, because God would never kill a prophet, according to the Quran. Now, keep in mind, Muhammad did not write the Quran. It was gathered after he died, and it was put together by the third Caliph Uthman in 650 AD. Okay? There's no miraculous confirmation that Muhammad was a prophet. So it's written 600 years after the events of Christianity. Why would we take a document written 600 years later to tell us what happened to Jesus when we have eyewitness testimony of what happened to Jesus?
Right.
So this is why I don't think Islam is the true world religion. Now, I'm not saying everything Islam teaches is false. That's not the case. I just think where it differs from Christianity, it's false. So that's the other great competitor to Christianity is Islam.
Right.
Okay. Now, most Muslims would agree with the first 3 points: truth, God, miracles. Where they're going to have a problem with is the New Testament. So that's where Christians and Muslims separate with regard. One place they separate with regard to what happened to Jesus.